Hello. Rather than hold a Zoom session, I thought I would make a quick audio tape for you and PowerPoint presentation on power and influence. This covers a whole chapter in the text, and I think it's extremely important when thinking about yourself, when thinking about your skills, when thinking about leadership, to be thinking about the importance of power in your life and in your development, and the importance of having power or being able to gather power. And I want to just share some thoughts on that as we go along. The difference between someone in an organization who can get an idea off the ground, get accepted, get people to go along with it, and someone who can't get ideas off the ground isn't a question necessarily of who has the better idea or who's the most intelligent. It's a question of who has political competence. And political competence is a skill you can learn. And in here, I'm kind of looking at the words power and the words political as kind of neutral words. Many times we ascribe negative characteristics to the word power and the word political, and there certainly are a number of negative things we can attach to both those words. But I think you have to look at them as neutral words. Power is something that can either be used for good or for ill, and the same with politics. The effective use of power is one of the most critical elements of management. Effective leaders are leaders who can make other people feel powerful. In fact, we have the word empowerment. And effective leaders were influential because they used their power to help other people accomplish exceptional tasks. It is extremely difficult to do the truly unusual without political clout. So, I think we need to explore this word political clout and need to explore how you can gain power for yourself, but using power in a way that's not abusive. There's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of negativity associated with the concept of power. However, power can be viewed as a sign of personal efficacy or personal competence. People who have power have the ability to shape their environment, whereas the powerless are molded by theirs. So I think you would agree that you want to feel powerful. You want to feel that you can impact things. It's a very debilitating to feel powerless in situations. So there is, and I think all of us in leadership positions and managerial positions need to really come to terms with this concept of power in our lives. Powerful managers, powerful leaders can intercede favorably on behalf of someone in trouble. They can get desired placements for talented subordinates. They can get expenditures well beyond their budget. They're able to move items on an agenda in meetings. They have good access to decision makers. In fact, people who have a lot of upward influence have regular and frequent contact with top decision makers. Many times powerful people have their ear to the ground in an organization and gain early information about things that are happening. So certainly, I think you can imagine you would like to work for someone who has these kind of characteristics. So, the relationship between power and your personal effectiveness is critical. But both a lack of power and the abuse of power are also debilitating and counterproductive. So power and personal effectiveness is critical, but also there's a fine line between abuse of power or lack of power. In contrast, empowerment uses sufficient amounts of personal power to achieve high levels of effectiveness. So this little chart from the book, I think, shows what we're trying to get at. You want to have sufficient power in order to feel empowered. You want to have sufficient power that doesn't lead to abuse. Because you're not going to be effective if you lack power, and you're going to be equally ineffective if you abuse your power. So this need we have for power, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to motivation, but this need we have for power is a fine line. And most people who want to be influential have a need for power. So let's look at the definition of power. I like to think of it as this way, that the potential to influence behavior. Many of the traditional definitions of power saw it as having authority over others. I choose to like the definition of it's the potential you have to influence behavior. And another way of stating it is getting things done. And all the implications for you and me is not that we need to avoid the use of power, but we need to learn how to use it well. So the two really specific management skills associated with this chapter are: how do we gain power? How do we overcome the feelings of powerlessness? And we'll talk about the gaining power a little bit. And then how do we convert power effectively into interpersonal influence? How do we get things done? How do we influence others to do things in ways that avoid us abusing that power? So let's talk about some of those a little bit. There are a number of steps we can take to enhance our influence, and I would like to talk. I'd like to talk about three things here. One is a personal paths to influence, personal characteristics that you have. Another one is job-related kinds of things, and I want to talk a little bit about the law of reciprocity. So, the book, the chapter talks about this a little bit. One of the personal ways that you have of gaining power and influence is expertise. Expanding your expertise through your knowledge and or experience. Wouldn't you agree that we tend to let experts influence us? That's how consultants make their money. We're hiring them for their expertise. Don't you tend to listen to people that you work with, that you recognize as having a lot of experience? So that's a biggie. Another important way you can, a personal characteristic you have to influence others, is personal attraction. Likeableness, friendship. One of the big 5 personality traits we had was agreeableness. We tend to like agreeable people. We tend to let agreeable people influence us. So people that we're personally attracted to, we let influence us. So how do you enhance your personal attractiveness to people? Well, that comes through building interpersonal relationships. People that have expertise at developing relationships, at communicating well. That's all personal attraction. Another way we gain influence is by effort. If we work hard, if we have a higher than expected commitment of time Are we putting in the time? Are we going the extra mile? We tend to let people who work hard influence us. And then legitimacy is another. Do we behave in ways that are consistent with the organization we work for? Do we behave in ways that are compatible? These are all 4 personal things that you can do to enhance your influence, your personal influence over others. Kind of a bit of a paradox from what I'm talking about is successful organizations have members who are capable of gaining power by fitting in. That's what I'm talking about with the legitimacy. But then using that power to challenge the prevailing belief system that in some sense was responsible for us gaining power. Remember I talked about these leadership skills have got to be sometimes paradoxical that we're working on in this class. Many ways you gain influence over others and influence on the organization by fitting in. But all of us know that organizations need to change. So at the same time, you have to use your influence to change the system that actually helped you succeed. Interesting. Okay, so those are all personal things that I've just talked about. There are some things that you can pay attention to in terms of the job itself you're doing and its path to influence in the organization. So the job you have in your organization, how central is it to the mission of what's happening? Do you have access to information? Do you have access to information? These are good. By the way, if you're thinking about a job in an organization, these are 5 good areas to look at in terms of the amount of influence the job gives you. How critical is the job that you're doing? Does it have an impact on tasks and outcomes? How critical is the job to the overall organization mission? If you're in an automobile company, you probably, if you're an engineer, etc., you probably are really critical. But some of the other areas that might be critical are finance and sales. Another important thing to ask about your job is how much flexibility do you have? How much discretion do you have over your time? People with a lot of discretion tend to have more influence. How visible is your job? Is your performance seen by influential people? Do people who have power see you, recognize you? In an organization, sometimes there's things you can do to get recognized. Maybe you volunteer to head up the United Way campaign. That's highly visible, and will seen by influential people, and it's not necessarily part of your chain of command. And then, how relevant is the work that you're doing? Is it aligned with the priorities of the organization? So these are 5 job-related things that can give you influence in the organization you're in. So your personal characteristics, as well as the type of job you have, are important in terms of potentially giving you influence in the organization. Now that I've talked a little bit about personal and job-related sources of power and influence for you, let me just talk a little bit about some strategies for influencing others. And one of the main ones I want to talk about is the law of reciprocity. It's almost the universal belief that people should be paid back for what they do. You know, it's the general rule that we all follow in taking a job. You sign up to go work for a company, and you're going to put your time and effort in, and the law of reciprocity says that you should be paid back for what you do. It's really a real basic principle of influence that underlies nearly all human transactions, organization transactions. I'm going to do for you because you're going to give me this back. And you're going to do for me, you're going to do a favor for me because I'm going to give you this back. These are exchanges. All of these transactional exchanges are under this law of reciprocity. So we might do things in order, we're going to get goods, we're going to get services, we're going to get sentiments even, gratitude, praise, stuff like that. Basically, we're going to get both tangible and or intangible paybacks. And that's kind of that law of reciprocity. Organizational influences depend on satisfactory exchanges. So hopefully whatever I get back from you is something that I'm going to value. So people are influential when they offer things that are valuable. And so there are, in any organization, there are many currencies that are valued and traded. And it's not just money and goods. So employees who are perceived by peers as generous have higher social status in an organization. Your generosity increases your productivity up to a point. It'll increase people's productivity. But too much generosity, when the employee is perceived as giving far more than he or she receives, hinders productivity. The more frequently an employee exchanges favors with peers, tendency is to have a higher status and productivity. So, in other words, if we're generously engaged in give and take with our peers, we can have a much higher status and sense of productivity going on. That's part of what's under this law of reciprocity. When we talk about motivation chapter, we'll get into this a little more when we talk about equity theory. We basically want equity in the exchanges. In the Change Masters, Cantor reported that successful influencers never lost sight of the ultimate goal, but were willing to be flexible about means. So a great book on this whole concept is The Change Masters, classic old-time book. So reciprocity is probably the main way we influence others to do things in an organizational setting. The book talks about a couple other ways. One is forcing. Forcing is through intimidation or pressure, or direct is coercion. Interestingly enough, forcing or fear has been one that's been the most common down through history. And it's probably the least productive way. It engenders the least productivity. Reciprocity is more a bargaining exchange. That's what I talked about. And then the other one is reason, appealing to personal values. This is an influence strategy that has been gaining a great deal of ascendancy in the last few years. You're appealing to the values of people and people wanting to do meaningful work. So that's an influence strategy that is quite commonly utilized. Intimidation and coercion, some of the pros and cons. It's quick and direct, but it stifles commitment, creates resentment. If you feel like you're being coerced or intimidated, it doesn't do much for your loyalty and commitment. One of the problems with a reciprocity system to the extreme is that it creates expectation of rewards for actions. So people come to expect all the time that they're going to get rewarded for everything they do. Reason enhances commitment and limits the need to monitor performance, but it requires considerable time and effort. Really, with reason, you're appealing to people's sense of wanting to do meaningful things with their work. And we probably will see as we go along that reason probably is maybe the most successful way to get people to be the most productive or appeal the most, especially when you think about throwing motivation into the mix. So, kind of a quote from our textbook: inexperienced, ineffective organizational members grumble about not having enough formal power to get the work done, and they covet the influence wielded at higher levels. In contrast, savvy organizational members realize that informal network power is available to individuals at all levels. Furthermore, they understand that informal personal power generally precedes rather than follows from formal organizational power. If you unpack this statement, and the reason I put it in here is that first sentence, we're not going to be effective if we feel powerless. The second part of this sentence is telling you that you don't need to wait until you get into a position of power for you to be influential. So it's real important to understand some of the dynamics of power in the informal organization. And that's why I challenge all of you to sit back and begin to think about how you influence others, how you are influenced by other people, and the importance of power in your own life. Okay, when we talked about decision making, I introduced this concept of reframing organizations to you. And I just want to quickly go back over it again. If you remember, I talked about the structural, the human, political, and symbolic. What I want to focus on in this quick webinar, since I'm talking about power, I want to focus on the political dimension. And you remember, I went through all of this with you, with the structural frame, and the human frame focuses on people, and the symbolic frame, it's the opposite of the rational frame. But the one I want to talk about in relation to this chapter is the political frame. And organizations are arenas of scarce resources. Power and influence affect allocation of resources. So you might want to go back and relook at some of these notes that I gave you on this. That conflict is expected. So if you are trying to influence getting things done, you're going to bump up against people who are trying to get things done. So conflict is going to happen. So bargaining, coercion, compromise tend to become a part of everyday organizational life. Maybe you don't want to use coercion as a way to influence. but you maybe have to guard yourself against people who use coercion on you. And basically, people operating in the political frame see an uneven distribution of power or a power vacuum if there are problems. So it's important to enhance your political skill and acumen. So if we look at this concept of leadership from a political point of view, and if an effective leader is someone who's an advocate, so you get involved in advocacy and coalition building. There's that fine line I talked about. If you cross that line, you might be viewed as a con artist or a hustler. You might be viewed as someone manipulating or managing by fraud. So, use of this political skill, there is a fine line between the positive or the negative side of it. So, again, the 4 frames. But let me talk about the political frame a little bit. That important decisions, there's an allocation of resources. Organizations are coalitions of interest groups that you have to influence. Interest groups have different values. Organizational goals arise from bargaining, negotiating, vying for a position. And power and conflict are central features of organizational life. So, I'm ending all this up as you need to become a good manager as politician. And what does it mean? Well, we have politics because of difference, scarce resources, and we all got to work together. That causes politics. The dilemma for you or for anyone is how do you confront the realities of diversity, scarcity, and self-interest and still channel human action in cooperative and socially valuable directions? In other words, how can you become a positive politician? So here are some of the skills of a manager who is a good politician. 1, they're able to create a vision and get support of people. So you're trying to create a vision of where you're headed, what you're doing. You have the ability to build a network. All of us think networking is a great skill to have. Well, that's a political skill. Through networking, you can assess relationships. You can also figure out where resistance is. And you can create processes to deal with resistance. And so you're trying to build a coalition. You're trying to figure where resistance is. And then you become good bargainers, good negotiators. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about conflict management. You're trying to, are you trying to claim value, maybe take a win-lose approach to life? Or are you trying to negotiate with others in a way that everyone can benefit? And that's sometimes called win-win approach, creating value rather than claiming value. So these are some of the skills to think about if you're going to be a successful politician. Having a vision, of being able to network and build coalitions, and then being able to bargain and negotiate. An effective political leader is an advocate, and an ineffective one is a con artist. So you're walking that fine line. So again, this is from Reframing Organization. So kind of a sum of where we've been. You gain power. And so I went through many of the areas where you have personal power, your expertise, your attraction. Where you sit in the organization gives you position power. all of these kind of are in you and as part of your power of who you are. And then there are various strategies that we talked about in order to have influence over others. The law of reciprocity, of reason, of coercion, and all of this leads to influence over others in order to get things done. So, that's my quick take on this discussion of power and influence. It takes about 30 minutes, so I'll see you later in class. Thank you.